In a peaceful neighborhood where life was simple and the lawns were neatly trimmed, the days typically passed without much excitement. Among the friendly faces and quiet charm, there was one figure who stood out: Karen. She was the self-appointed guardian of order, the queen of the cul-de-sac, wielding her clipboard and a demeanor as sharp as her pointed sunglasses. Her mere presence could make mailboxes stand a little straighter and grass blades tremble in unison. Our story begins with a seemingly innocent decision. As homeowners enjoying the tranquility of our property, we decided to set up a small camping spot in the backyard, a place for family bonding under the stars, complete with a cozy tent and a modest fire pit. It was nothing extravagant, just an ordinary family activity. But in Karen's world, where everything had to adhere to her self-made rules, this was an unforgivable crime against her vision of perfection. The first confrontation happened on a sunny Saturday morning. Karen appeared as if summoned by the scent of toasted marshmallows. Marching across the sidewalk with her clipboard clutched tightly, she stopped at the edge of our property, hands on her hips, surveying our little campsite like a battlefield. "This," she declared, her voice dripping with authority, "is unacceptable." We were taken aback. "It's just a small camping setup on our land," I explained, trying to maintain a friendly tone. But Karen was not one for reasonable conversations. "It's against neighborhood rules," she barked, pointing to an imaginary rulebook that seemed to exist only in her mind. "You can't just turn this place into a campground. It disrupts the aesthetic harmony of the area." Her words hung in the air, absurd and yet delivered with such conviction that I almost felt guilty for owning a tent. Karen's intensity turned what should have been a peaceful day into the start of a neighborhood spectacle. What followed was a clash of personalities, escalating drama, and a few surprises no one saw coming. Karen's tirade over our harmless camping setup marked the beginning of her latest power trip. Her ability to invent and enforce rules that didn't exist was truly remarkable, equal parts absurd and infuriating. Armed with her ever-present clipboard, she began patrolling the neighborhood with a renewed sense of purpose, as though our small campsite represented a direct attack on her carefully curated sense of order. The next day we found a notice of violation slipped under our door. It was written in Karen's impeccable yet menacing handwriting and included a list of grievances about our camping activity. Unauthorized use of property for recreational purposes, it read, along with the claim that camping was strictly prohibited in residential zones. There was no mention of where these alleged rules came from, but Karen's note ended with a dire warning about potential fines and further action. At first we couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. "She's really outdone herself this time," I said, holding up the notice for my spouse to see. But our amusement turned to disbelief when Karen herself arrived later that afternoon, clipboard in hand, ready to deliver her complaints in person. "You've received the notice, I assume?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. Before we could answer, she launched into a speech about maintaining neighborhood standards and setting a bad example for others. It was as if the mere sight of our tent would cause chaos to spread through the community like wildfire. Her enforcement tactics grew even more ridiculous. Karen stood on the sidewalk, watching us with eagle eyes, making notes as though we were under surveillance. At one point she even brought out a tape measure to check the distance between the tent and our property line. "It's a fire hazard," she exclaimed dramatically, shaking her head as though we had committed a grave offense. Despite our efforts to remain calm, it became clear that reasoning with Karen was futile. The more we tried to explain that we weren't breaking any rules, the more determined she became to prove otherwise. This wasn't about the campsite anymore. It was about control. And Karen was on a mission to assert hers, no matter how absurd her methods became. Dealing with Karen's relentless antics required a level of patience and creativity we hadn't anticipated. At first we tried to reason with her, hoping that logic and common sense might break through her wall of entitlement. "Karen," I said one afternoon as she stood on the edge of our property, clipboard in hand, "there's nothing in the HOA rules about camping on private land." We checked. Her response was immediate and theatrical. "I'm sure there's a clause about maintaining the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood," she snapped, clutching her clipboard tighter, as if it contained the holy scriptures of suburban order. "And this," she said, pointing at our tent as if it were a biohazard, "is definitely not harmonious." I couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. "Karen, it's just a tent. It's not neon green or covered in blinking lights." Her gasp was so exaggerated it could have been mistaken for a scene in a soap opera. "That's not the point," she shrieked, her voice climbing an octave. "You're setting a precedent. What if everyone starts camping in their yards? This is a neighborhood, not a national park." Realizing that reasoning wouldn't work, we decided to take a different approach. Subtle retaliation. We began making small, innocuous changes to our camping setup just to see how Karen would react. First, we moved the tent a few feet closer to the house, thinking it might pacify her. It didn't. "You're still violating the rules," she yelled from the sidewalk. Next, we added a string of fairy lights for a touch of ambience. This seemed to infuriate her even more. "Those lights are not HOA approved," she shouted, waving her clipboard like a gavel. Meanwhile, we couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. The more we played along, the more Karen escalated her efforts to restore order. Karen's retaliation reached new heights when she began threatening to escalate the matter further. "I'll report this to the HOA board," she warned, her tone full of righteous indignation. "And don't think I won't follow through." It was clear that Karen was on a mission and she wasn't going to back down without a fight. Unfortunately for her, neither were we. As Karen's antics escalated, the neighborhood started to take notice. Our once quiet community turned into a stage for drama, with Karen as the self-proclaimed star. Her constant patrolling, clipboard in hand, became a spectacle that neighbors couldn't ignore. Some found her behavior annoying, while others secretly enjoyed the entertainment. The reactions from our neighbors ranged from supportive to downright hilarious. Tom, the retiree next door, pulled me aside one evening to share his own Karen horror story. "She once accused my cat of trespassing on her lawn," he said, shaking his head. "Can you believe that? A cat." He chuckled, adding, "I think she just doesn't like the idea of anyone, or anything, having freedom." Meanwhile, another neighbor, Susan, seemed to thrive on the drama, encouraging Karen's crusade with sly comments like, "Well, rules are rules, you know." Susan was one of the few who openly supported Karen, though we suspected it was more about enjoying the chaos than actual agreement. In contrast, several neighbors quietly expressed their support for us. At a casual gathering, one whispered, "We've all been victims of her clipboard at some point. Last year she tried to fine me for having unapproved garden gnomes." Another chimed in, "She's been obsessed with the HOA for years, but honestly most of us just ignore her." The neighborhood buzzed with gossip and speculation. "Did you see Karen taking pictures of their tent again?" someone asked during a casual chat at the local coffee shop. Another neighbor joked, "What's next? Will she fine us for leaving our windows open?" Despite the humor, there was an underlying sense of camaraderie. Neighbors who had previously kept to themselves began sharing stories and laughing about Karen's antics. In a strange way, her over-the-top behavior brought people closer together. It became clear that Karen's crusade wasn't just against us. It was part of her ongoing quest to control the entire neighborhood. As the days went on, the community started taking subtle jabs at Karen. One neighbor hung an unauthorized cat crossing sign on their fence, while another set up a small camping tent in their front yard, complete with a sign that read, "HOA-approved campsite." These small acts of defiance added to the growing sense of rebellion against Karen's reign, proving that while she might wield her clipboard with authority, her influence over the neighborhood was far from absolute. Karen's behavior reached new levels of absurdity as she doubled down on her mission to enforce her imaginary rules. Determined to put an end to what she saw as a blatant disregard for her version of order, she started taking increasingly drastic measures to prove her point. One afternoon we caught her trespassing on our property. Clipboard in hand, she was crouched near our tent, using a ruler to measure the distance between the campsite and the fence. "This is a safety violation," she declared when we confronted her. "You're endangering the entire neighborhood." She tried to justify her presence by claiming it was her civic duty to enforce the rules. We, of course, had to politely remind her that trespassing was not, in fact, a civic duty. Karen didn't stop there. She filed multiple complaints with the HOA, each more ridiculous than the last. One claimed that our fairy lights caused light pollution, while another insisted that the smell of our campfire disrupted the natural aroma of the neighborhood. To add to the absurdity, she began distributing flyers to other neighbors, warning them about the dangers of allowing camping on private property. The flyer included dramatic phrases like, "This could happen to you," accompanied by poorly cropped photos of our tent. We decided it was time to fight back. First, we carefully documented every encounter with Karen, her trespassing, her outrageous complaints, and her public outbursts. Then we started attending HOA meetings to address the situation head-on. At one particularly tense meeting, Karen arrived with a massive binder labeled Neighborhood Violations, filled with notes, photos, and what she called evidence of our alleged misdeeds. When it was our turn to speak, we presented our own evidence. Video footage of Karen trespassing, copies of the HOA rules proving we had broken none, and testimonials from supportive neighbors. As we laid out our case, the room shifted. The HOA board, clearly irritated by Karen's antics, started asking her pointed questions about her behavior. "Karen," one board member asked, "why were you measuring their property line? That's not part of your responsibilities." Karen's composure began to crack. She stammered, tried to shift the blame, and eventually resorted to claiming she was protecting the community. But her arguments fell flat. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that Karen's power trip had backfired. The HOA board warned her to stop harassing us and issued a formal reprimand for her behavior. Despite the victory, Karen wasn't done yet. Her desperation to maintain control only made her actions more ridiculous. But the tide had turned, and the neighborhood was no longer willing to tolerate her antics. The once untouchable queen of the cul-de-sac was starting to lose her grip. Karen's reign over the neighborhood finally came crashing down in the most satisfying way possible. After weeks of escalating drama, her antics had not only alienated the community but also caught the attention of the HOA board. Armed with our evidence, we were ready for the final showdown. At the next HOA meeting, Karen showed up with her infamous Neighborhood Violations binder, looking as smug as ever. She strutted to the front of the room, ready to present her latest grievances. "This neighborhood is falling apart because people refuse to follow the rules," she declared, slapping her binder onto the table. "And I have the evidence to prove it." The board let her speak, but as she rattled off her complaints, ranging from our illegal camping setup to the so-called light pollution from our fairy lights, it was clear that patience in the room was wearing thin. The moment she finished, the board president calmly turned to us and asked if we had anything to say. We presented our case methodically, starting with the HOA's own rules, which clearly stated that private property activities like camping were not prohibited. Then we showed video clips of Karen trespassing on our land, measuring distances with a ruler and taking photos of our backyard without permission. The room fell silent as the footage played. Even Karen's most loyal supporters looked uncomfortable. Finally, we shared testimonials from neighbors, detailing their own experiences with Karen's overreach. One neighbor recounted how she tried to fine them for their unapproved bird feeder. Another described how Karen had once demanded they repaint their front door to match her color harmony standards. Laughter rippled through the room as the absurdity of her actions became undeniable. The turning point came when the HOA president addressed Karen directly. "Karen," he said firmly, "your behavior has gone far beyond what is acceptable. You've overstepped your role and caused unnecessary conflict in this community." He announced that Karen would no longer be allowed to act on behalf of the HOA and issued her a formal warning for trespassing and harassment. But the real poetic justice came when the board revealed that Karen herself had violated HOA rules. Her meticulously maintained holiday display, complete with oversized, unapproved decorations, was a glaring infraction. The president handed her a violation notice, and for the first time, Karen was utterly speechless. The room erupted into quiet cheers and stifled laughter. Karen, red-faced and defeated, gathered her binder and stormed out of the meeting. That night, the neighborhood celebrated in subtle but collective defiance. Fairy lights twinkled in yards, campfires burned brightly, and a sense of freedom settled over the cul-de-sac. Karen's reign had ended and justice had been served. The neighborhood could finally breathe easy, knowing the days of clipboard tyranny were over. With Karen's dramatic exit from the HOA meeting and her clipboard permanently retired, peace returned to the neighborhood. The air seemed lighter, the lawns greener, and the mailboxes stood taller without her watchful glare. Life went back to normal, but not without a few laughs as neighbors shared stories of the spectacle. Karen's presence slowly faded into the background. She still lived in the neighborhood, but her influence had all but disappeared. No longer the self-appointed enforcer, she kept a low profile, avoiding eye contact and skipping HOA meetings altogether. Occasionally she'd send a glare our way when passing by, but it was nothing we couldn't handle with a polite wave and a satisfied smile. The neighborhood, now free from her reign, grew closer. Neighbors who had rarely spoken before bonded over the shared experience. Weekend barbecues became a common sight, fairy lights adorned more homes than ever, and our backyard camping setup became a tradition. To freedom, someone joked as we toasted marshmallows one evening. As for Karen, she eventually moved away, citing a need for a quieter, more disciplined community. We all suspected she was looking for a new kingdom to rule, but no one dared to ask. Her departure felt like the final chapter in a story that had tested everyone's patience and brought the neighborhood together. Looking back, the entire ordeal seemed almost surreal. Who knew that a simple camping trip on our own land could lead to such chaos? But it was over, and the lessons learned were invaluable. Community triumphs over pettiness, and a little humor goes a long way in dealing with even the most entitled personalities. In the end, our neighborhood found its harmony, not through Karen's strict rules, but through shared laughter, camaraderie, and a newfound appreciation for freedom. Karen-proofing became an inside joke, and life carried on better and brighter than before. Have you ever had a Karen in your neighborhood? What's the most ridiculous thing they've ever done? Share your stories in the comments. I can't wait to hear them. If you enjoyed this wild ride through Karen's antics and love hearing about entitled moments like this, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you want more entertaining stories from the Karenverse, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Your support helps keep the chaos and the laughs coming.